Some stories begin with a conversation, but this one begins with a whisper that changed everything. At a quiet Navy ceremony, a single-dad janitor leaned close to a high-ranking admiral and murmured 6 words that froze her world. "You're in danger, pretend I'm your wife." What followed was a journey through hidden pasts, buried loyalties, and a truth powerful enough to save or destroy the people they cared about most. And beneath all the danger, something unexpected began to grow. Courage healing, and a love neither of them saw coming. Before we begin, if you enjoy heartfelt cinematic stories that remind us of bravery, kindness, and second chances, feel free to subscribe to our channel. It helps us bring more inspiring stories to you every week. Now, let's begin. The late afternoon sun cast a soft golden haze over the naval base courtyard, giving everything a dignified warmth that felt almost ceremonial. Flags rustled gently in the ocean breeze. The brass band tuned their instruments, and dozens of officers moved in crisp formation, each uniform pressed, each metal polished to perfection. It was the kind of day Admiral Caroline Ward had always cherished, orderly, honorable, predictable. But fate doesn't always knock loudly. Sometimes it arrives quietly like a whisper. Caroline stood near the center of the courtyard, exchanging polite nods with commanders and veterans, maintaining her composed posture. She had spent her entire career building a reputation for steadiness. Today's ceremony, meant to honor strategic personnel and civilian contributors, was supposed to be a calm, structured event. Then she felt it, a presence approaching from the side. Silent, controlled, purposeful. She turned just enough to catch the face of a man she didn't recognize in uniform, or rather, in a uniform that didn't match the tone of the event at all. He wore the deep olive shirt of a janitor, sleeves rolled neatly, a utility belt on his hip. His dark blonde hair was longer than regulations typically allowed, and yet somehow, he didn't look out of place. There was an undeniable composure to him, the kind that came from years of discipline, not mops and brooms. Before she could question the intrusion, he stepped just close enough for his breath to touch her ear. His voice came low, steady, almost impossibly calm. "You're in danger," he murmured. "Pretend I'm your husband." For a moment, the entire courtyard seemed to fall silent. The world blurred. Even Caroline's heartbeat seemed to stop. She drew in a breath, stiffening. "Excuse me," she whispered sharply, barely moving her lips. The man didn't flinch. He didn't look at her. He didn't even shift his stance. Instead, he subtly angled his body closer, just enough to shield her from the view behind them. "Don't react," he added. "4 men at your 9 o'clock have been watching you for the last 7 minutes. Their behavior pattern isn't normal." Caroline's instinct was to spin around and assess the threat herself, but years of naval intelligence training held her still. She breathed through her nose, exhaling controlled calm, her eyes sharpened, scanning only what she could see in her periphery. "Who are you?" she asked under her breath. He spoke without hesitation. "Name's Brandon Cole." Another heartbeat. A pause that felt like standing on the edge of a cliff. "And you're a janitor," she murmured. Today, he replied simply. There was no arrogance, no apology, just fact. Before she could absorb that, Brandon shifted again, his movement subtle, practiced. His right hand gently touched her forearm, not grabbing, guiding. A gesture so respectful it startled her more than if he had dragged her away. "Walk with me," he said. "Slow pace. Smile if you can." Caroline wasn't the type to follow strangers, much less take orders from them. But something about the tone of his voice, the absolute certainty, sent a chill of instinctive trust down her spine. She inhaled, lifted her chin, and allowed him to lead her through the crowd. As they moved, The shift in atmosphere was palpable. Caroline caught the briefest glimpse of reflections in polished brass panels. 4 men unfamiliar dressed too casually for a military base. Their eyes moved like hunters waiting for an opening. Just enough to confirm Brandon wasn't imagining things. She kept her expression neutral. "You're going to explain this," she murmured tightly. "I will," Brandon replied, maintaining his easy pace. "But right now, don't break character." He curved their path toward the edge of the courtyard, navigating gracefully through clusters of officers greeting each other. Every step he took felt calculated, not threatening, but protective. Caroline risked another glance. The 4 men were adjusting their positions. A ripple of unease crawled through her chest. "Why pretend to be my husband?" she asked. Brandon's eyes flicked toward a reflective window. "Because they won't approach a woman flanked by someone they think she trusts. They're opportunists. They wait for isolation." Caroline swallowed hard. She had faced political pressure, strategic crises, international negotiations, but this was different. This was physical danger she couldn't yet measure or name. Still, she managed to keep her voice controlled. "You notice these things?" "Often?" she asked. Brandon didn't answer immediately. His eyes scanned their surroundings with the precision of radar. "More often than I'd like," he finally replied. They reached a quieter corridor leading toward the administrative wing. Sunlight streamed through tall glass panels, painting fractured reflections along the floor. Brandon subtly maneuvered himself between her and the open walkway. Her pulse quickened. This man wasn't improvising. This was training. Deep training. Caroline slowed her step just enough for him to feel her resistance. "I outrank almost everyone on this base," she whispered, "and I deserve to know what's happening." Brandon stopped walking. For the first time, he turned to fully face her. His expression was calm, too calm for someone supposedly just a janitor. His blue-gray eyes carried the weight of someone who had seen storms few could weather. "I'm not here to frighten you, Admiral," he said quietly. But I couldn't watch them circle closer. I couldn't just stand there and hope nothing happened. The sincerity in his voice, deep, steady, almost wounded, sent a tremor through her chest. Before she could respond, Brandon's attention snapped past her shoulder. "They followed us," he whispered. Caroline stiffened. "Stay close," he said softly. "Just a few more steps." And in that moment, between the glow of sunset and the shadow of an unknown threat, Caroline Ward understood something she hadn't grasped before. This was the exact moment the trajectory of her life quietly, irrevocably changed. The quiet hallway outside the administrative wing felt strangely hollow, as if the air itself had paused to listen. Admiral Caroline Ward walked beside Brandon Cole, her posture straight, her breath steady, every instinct honed by years of service, demanding she understand, really understand, what was happening. But something unsettled her far more than the 4 men trailing them from a distance. It was him, the janitor with the whisper that shook the entire foundation of her day. Brandon walked half a step ahead, not blocking her, but very clearly watching over her. Each time a new angle in the corridor opened up, his eyes swept it quick, subtle, efficient. Not the frantic scanning of an amateur, no nervous finger-tapping, no exaggerated caution. No, this was the silence of a man who lived inside awareness. Caroline finally exhaled. "Start talking," she murmured. Her voice contained her authority unmistakable. Brandon didn't slow. "I saw them before you walked on stage," he said. "They weren't part of base personnel. No badges, no event lanyards, no military posture. But they stayed close. Too close." Caroline resisted the urge to look over her shoulder. "You're certain?" He nodded once. "I've seen that kind of circling behavior before. They scan entry points, exits, shadows where cameras don't reach, and they stayed focused on you. His words were delivered without drama, no embellishment, just truth. They reached the end of the hallway, where a pair of tall windows overlooked the courtyard. The band was still playing, officers still mingled. A few civilians in dress attire took photographs. Everything looked normal, beautiful even. The ceremony was moving forward without a single ripple of tension. It chilled Caroline more than if alarms had gone off. She folded her arms. "You seem remarkably calm for someone who claims I'm being followed." Brandon's jaw tightened ever so slightly. "It doesn't help anyone if I panic." "And what makes you think I would?" she challenged. He turned toward her, and for the first time, she caught something in his expression, a guarded gravity, like a man standing at the edge of a memory he didn't wish to revisit. "People who lead," he said quietly, "tend to hide their fear better than most." Caroline's chest shifted with something she hadn't expected recognition. But she kept her tone stern. "You still haven't answered who you are, or why you noticed them, or why you assumed it was your job to protect me." Brandon looked toward the courtyard again, examining angles she couldn't see. "It wasn't my job. It was just the right thing to do," he said. She studied him, searching for deception. But he didn't look like a liar. He looked like a man who had practiced telling only fragments of truth because the full story was too heavy for most people to hear. And in his eyes, quiet, steady, faintly wounded, she saw something unsettlingly familiar, the look of someone who had lost more than he was willing to say aloud. "Brandon," she said, softer but still firm. "I am asking you directly. Are you in some kind of trouble?" His shoulders rose slightly with a slow breath. "No, Admiral. Trouble doesn't follow me anymore." He paused. "But sometimes I still recognize the kind of men who used to." Before she could respond, his gaze sharpened. Caroline instinctively stepped closer to him, following his line of sight. Reflected in the window's angled glass, she saw them 4 silhouettes lingering near the corridor entrance, too far to hear, but clearly watching. Her pulse thudded once, slow and heavy. "They're persistent," she murmured. "They're patient," Brandon corrected. "That's what worries me." Caroline steadied herself. "You don't think they're here for me personally?" "No," he said. "But your leverage." A cold realization settled over her. She had dealt with foreign intelligence, military politics, and high-level threats, but none of those forces operated this quietly, this informally, this dangerously close to civilian lines. "What do they want?" she asked. Brandon hesitated, choosing his words. "I'm not sure yet." But they were testing proximity, seeing how close they could get without raising alarm. Caroline straightened. "Well, congratulations. You've raised mine." For the first time, a flicker of something, almost a smile, touched the corner of Brandon's lips. Not amusement, not arrogance, just a faint acknowledgement of her sharpness. But just as quickly, the softness vanished. "We need to move," he said. "The more open the space, the harder it is for them to close in." Caroline bristled. That almost sounded like an order. He met her eyes, steady, respectful, unapologetic. "It was advice, Admiral. You can choose to ignore it." A strange, inexplicable warmth stirred in her chest, annoyance mixed with an unwilling admiration. She exhaled. "Fine. Lead the way." They continued walking, turning into a narrower hallway lined with old photographs of retired commanders. Caroline's heels clicked softly against the polished floor. Brandon's steps were fluid, nearly silent, as though he had learned how to disappear in plain sight. After a moment, she spoke again. "You still didn't tell me how you recognized them so quickly." Brandon kept his gaze forward. "Patterns," he said. "Posture. Eyes that never settle. Men who stand like they're waiting for permission to act." Caroline narrowed her eyes. And you learned to read all that? Mopping floors? He didn't react to the jab. I've learned a lot of things. This job just pays the bills. Something about that answer felt intentionally incomplete. Where were you trained? She pressed. Brandon stopped walking. Not abruptly, just a subtle, controlled halt. He turned halfway toward her, the corridor's dim light outlining the quiet strength in his profile. Admiral, he said slowly. Right now isn't the moment for that conversation. Caroline opened her mouth, but something in his eyes stopped her. Not fear. Not secrecy. Not rebellion. Pain. Deep, disciplined pain. Before she could speak again, he angled his head. They're getting closer. We should move. Caroline instinctively took a small step toward him, not out of fear, but alignment. Trust forming without permission. As they resumed walking, her mind raced. Who was this man? What past had carved such precision into his instincts? And why did her heart feel like it was taking notes faster than her head? The courtyard music faded behind them, replaced by the hum of fluorescent lights. Caroline Ward, Admiral Strategist Leader, felt the first quiet tremor of something impossible to deny. This janitor saw danger before she did, and that truth alone upended everything she thought she understood about him and about herself. The conference room door clicked shut behind them, sealing out the noise of the ceremony and the murmurs from wandering officers. The soundproof walls created an immediate hush, an almost sacred silence, broken only by the faint hum of the overhead lights. Caroline Ward stood tall at the head of the table, her uniform immaculate, her posture uncompromising. She had commanded squadrons, orchestrated high-stakes negotiations, and faced pressures that would have crushed lesser officers. But never had she been pulled into a mystery, wrapped inside a janitor with the posture of a soldier and the eyes of a ghost. Across from her, Brandon Cole stood near the window, hands loosely at his sides. Not defensive, not nervous, just contained, as if he'd spent years learning how to shrink his presence while still being prepared to react in a heartbeat. Caroline folded her arms. You're going to tell me the truth now. Brandon didn't answer immediately. His gaze drifted toward the courtyard below, where officers still laughed and mingled blissfully, unaware of the quiet tension high above them. You don't owe me the whole story, she added, her voice steady but firm. But you owe me enough to know what danger I'm in. He inhaled slowly, his chest rising with the weight of a memory. It's not you, thereafter he said. Not exactly. Then who she pressed. Me. The word hung in the air like a dropped anchor, pulling the room down with it. Caroline's jaw tightened. You expect me to believe a group of unidentified men infiltrated a naval ceremony to get close to a janitor with no clearance? Brandon gave a faint, humorless exhale. I'm not a janitor. Not originally. He turned toward her fully, and for the first time Caroline saw it. The rigid discipline in his stance, the perfectly controlled breathing the quiet storm held behind his eyes. She had seen this posture in war rooms and special operations, briefings, in men who walked the razor edge of heroism and regret. But seeing it in him, a man sweeping hallways and cleaning floors, felt unreal. Go on, she said quietly. Brandon rubbed the back of his hand, a subtle nervous habit that didn't match the rest of his composed exterior. I was part of a unit he began, a long time ago. What unit? She asked. He looked up, meeting her gaze with a depth that sent a faint shiver through her spine. Delta Ghost Line. Caroline felt her breath catch. That name was spoken like folklore around the Navy whispers about a classified division that technically didn't exist. A team deployed where the government wanted no trail, no questions, no headlines. If Ghost Line truly existed, it operated in shadows so deep, no sunlight or accountability ever reached. That's not real, Caroline said softly. though her gut told her otherwise. Brandon didn't argue. He didn't need to. When I enlisted, he said, I wanted to belong to something that mattered. Something that protected people even if no one ever knew our names. A shadow crossed his expression, a shadow not from the room, but from some old battlefield only he could see. We operated in places that never made the news, he continued, neutralizing threats before they touched American soil, extracting people who should have been lost forever, recovering things that weren't supposed to exist. Caroline listened, the weight of his words sinking into her like cold water. What happened to the unit, she asked. Brandon's eyes dimmed. One mission went wrong, horribly wrong. He paused long enough that she could hear the faint tightening in his breath. I was the ranking officer on that deployment, he said. It wasn't supposed to be complicated. A simple retrieval. In and out. His fingers curled slightly, not clenched, but remembering something that hurt. Intel was bad. We walked into a trap, one of my men. He didn't make it out. Caroline's chest tightened. I reviewed every second of the mission footage. Brandon continued. Every tactical choice, every command. There was no perfect decision, no simple fix. But I still took responsibility. He lifted his eyes to hers, regret hanging heavy in their depths. So I signed off on my own removal. Said the failure was mine alone. Caroline felt a quiet ache settle inside her. Most men she'd known in command roles fought tooth and nail to preserve rank, to protect pride, to maintain authority. Brandon had walked away instead, for the sake of his team, for the sake of honor. You sacrificed your career? She whispered. I saved theirs, he replied softly. He exhaled, the memory visibly pressing against him. They offered to transfer me quietly, keep me somewhere off paper. But I couldn't do it anymore. I lost my wife shortly after car accident. Just me and Declan left. Something fragile flickered in his voice at his son's name. So I left everything behind, he said. Took the first job that let me keep a roof over his head. A quiet job. No stress. No headlines. No bullets. Caroline felt a sudden, inexplicable urge to comfort him, an urge she would never admit openly. Brandon's pain wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. It was the kind of pain soldiers carried like a badge they never asked for. So the men from earlier, she began. They're connected to someone from my past, Brandon said. Someone who didn't appreciate me taking responsibility for that mission. Your old teammate, Caroline realized. Brandon nodded slowly. Darius Venn. The name landed heavily, rippling across the surface of the room. He blames me for the fallout, Brandon continued. For the charges that were filed. For the investigation that followed. Caroline's brows lowered. And he wants revenge. Not just revenge. Brandon shook his head. He wants something he thinks I have. Caroline took a step closer, her voice quietly urgent. Do you have it? He met her gaze with absolute honesty. Yes. Caroline's pulse quickened. But it's not a weapon, Admiral Brandon added. It's the one thing that could expose everything he did. Everything he covered up. Silence settled again, heavy knowing. Brandon looked down, voice softening with something unexpectedly vulnerable. I didn't want this life to touch anyone else, he said. Especially you. Caroline held his gaze, and in that moment she saw it clearly. He wasn't protecting himself. He was protecting everyone but himself. The weight of that realization pressed into her chest. Brandon, she said gently. But he looked away first, because some ghosts weren't ready to be seen. Not yet. The afternoon light had begun to fade when Admiral Caroline Ward and Brandon Cole stepped out of the conference room. The ceremony had dispersed into gentle conversations and polite laughter across the courtyard, but Caroline felt a subtle shift in the air, like the calm before a storm that hadn't yet announced its arrival. The truth Brandon had just shared, clung to her like a second skin. Delta Ghost Line, a classified unit that officially didn't exist. A failed mission, a broken man carrying secrets too heavy for the world to see. And now shadows from that buried past were walking freely across a naval base. Caroline inhaled slowly, steadying herself. She needed answers, clear, complete answers that could shape her next steps. But as she watched Brandon walk beside her, she realized something he had spent years learning: how to carry pain without showing it. He had spent the same years learning how to expect danger where others saw none. That was why, when he suddenly slowed his stride, she felt her pulse jump. His eyes narrowed, focused on something far beyond the visible. "What is it?" she murmured. Brandon didn't answer immediately. He was watching the flow of people, the rhythm of their movements, searching for disruptions. It felt like standing beside a radar system, disguised as a man. Then his gaze fixed on the far side of the courtyard. Caroline followed it, and there, tucked into the shadow of a stone archway, stood a man she didn't recognize. Tall, dressed too casually for the ceremony, hands in his pockets, posture relaxed, but his eyes, those eyes were tracking them with the cold precision of someone collecting data. Brandon murmured, "That's not one of the 4 from earlier." Caroline's stomach tightened. "How can you tell I remember faces?" Brandon said quietly. "Even the ones I don't want to." The man under the archway looked away for a moment when a group of officers passed. When the coast cleared, his eyes returned right to them, not wandering, not curious. Focused. Caroline's heartbeat pulsed in her ears. Brandon leaned slightly closer, his voice barely audible. "They're changing tactics. First they circled. Now they're stationed. Watching. Determining a pattern," she asked. His jaw tightened. "Or waiting for someone." Before she could ask who, the man under the archway raised his hand, subtle like brushing hair back. But Brandon exhaled sharply. "That's a signal," he said. Caroline's breath caught. "You sure positive?" A quiet dread slid down her spine. Then, almost on cue, a second unfamiliar man appeared near the flagpoles. Then another near the steps. Their presence dispersed just enough to blend into the scenery, but Caroline saw it now. They weren't drifting. They were positioning. Her voice lowered. "Brandon." "How deep does this go?" He swallowed, eyes scanning the expanding perimeter. "Deep enough that they've followed me for over a year," he said. Quietly at first, from far away, then closer. Testing boundaries. "And you didn't report it?" she asked, incredulous. "To who?" Brandon replied softly. "My unit doesn't exist. My record doesn't exist. And the men following me are ghosts in a system that wouldn't acknowledge them either." His words cut through her like a blade of ice. This wasn't just about old grudges. This wasn't just about a man seeking revenge. This was about something larger, something that operated in the cracks between official channels. "Who are they working for now?" she asked. Brandon hesitated. Then he said the name she had already begun to fear. Darius Venn. It was spoken quietly, but the weight behind it was undeniable. "Darius didn't just blame me for the mission gone wrong," Brandon continued. "He built a network afterward. People loyal to him, not the Navy. People who owe him favors, and people who lost everything when the investigation started." Caroline felt a chill trace her spine. "So this man, your former teammate, he's what running his own off-the-books operation." "Something like that," Brandon said. "He's always been resourceful, dangerous, smart enough to avoid direct confrontation, and persistent enough to pursue you for years," she pressed. Brandon nodded once. "He believes I have something that can expose him." Caroline studied him. A muscle twitched in Brandon's jaw. "I didn't plan to. But after the mission, I recovered evidence. Records, logs, communications. Things that prove what really happened, And who orchestrated the trap? Caroline inhaled sharply. You're saying he set you up? Not just me, Brandon said quietly. All of us. He wanted to eliminate the unit, start fresh with men loyal only to him. But the plan backfired. One man died. Others nearly followed. I took the blame to protect them. But he thinks I walked away with something that can destroy him. Caroline's voice softened. And did you? He held her gaze, steady, pained, honest. Yes. The world seemed to tilt around her. All at once, the situation snapped into focus with terrifying clarity. He's not after revenge, Caroline whispered. He's trying to erase the last piece of evidence that can bring him down. Brandon's silence was confirmation. And you think he'll come after me, she said. He already has, Brandon answered. Because he knows one thing for certain: I would never let an innocent person get dragged into this. Caroline's breath trembled for a moment. Not from fear, but from the realization of what she was now entangled in. Before she could speak, Brandon stepped slightly in front of her, subtle but unmistakable. His voice dropped urgent. Don't look now. But the man under the archway just made another signal. Caroline resisted instinct. What kind? A regroup signal, he said. They're closing ranks. She straightened, every fiber of training kicking into place. What do you need me to do? She said. The corner of Brandon's mouth twitched, not a smile, but an acknowledgement. Right now, trust me. She exhaled. I already do. Something flickered through his expression. Surprise, gratitude, maybe a touch of sorrow. Then his voice steadied again. Let's move before they do. And together, they stepped into the dimming light, not as a janitor and an admiral, but as two people walking toward a storm. Neither had asked for, yet both felt strangely destined to face. By the time the sun slipped below the horizon, the naval base had quieted. The last officers were leaving the courtyard, their steps echoing lightly on the pavement as laughter faded into the distance. A warm amber glow washed over the buildings, making the world appear softer than the tension that now curled beneath Caroline Ward's ribs. She and Brandon Cole moved with steady purpose toward the parking lot, keeping an unspoken formation close enough to project unity, far enough not to draw unwanted attention. The shadows lengthened behind them, stretching across the asphalt like quiet reminders that the world had changed for both of them in a single afternoon. Are you sure they're not following us now? Caroline asked, lowering her voice as they neared her vehicle. They're not close, Brandon replied, but that doesn't mean they're gone. She exhaled through her nose. This isn't a situation I take lightly. A faint, dry chuckle escaped him. Neither do I. Something about his tone, worn, tired, yet steady, made Caroline look at him longer than necessary. He wasn't afraid. He wasn't even unsettled. He simply carried danger as though he'd known it all his life. Get in, she said. He didn't argue. That alone impressed her. Once they were inside her SUV, Caroline locked the doors, her fingers brushing the cool metal of the steering wheel. Brandon sat beside her quietly, scanning the area through the side mirror and rear window. Not paranoid, calculated. You trust me being in your vehicle? He asked. I trust my instincts, she replied. They haven't failed me yet. He nodded once, a small gesture of respect. Caroline adjusted the mirror, started the engine, and eased the SUV out of the parking lot. For several minutes, the road was silent except for the hum of the tires and the muted breath of the ocean breeze slipping through the vents. Finally, she asked the question she had avoided since they'd left the base. Where do you live? Brandon hesitated, not because he didn't want to tell her, but because the answer carried weight. Off the old coastal road, he said. Small neighborhood. Quiet. No through traffic. And your son? She asked. He looked out the window for a moment, his expression softening in a way she hadn't seen before. Declan is at home. Probably finishing homework. He'll be wondering why I'm late." Caroline bit back the dozens of questions forming in her mind. She had seen hardened soldiers speak of missions with dry detachment, but when Brandon spoke of his son, something within him softened, almost glowed. "You raise him alone?" she asked gently. "Yes," Brandon said. "Since he was 3. Caroline swallowed. "I'm sorry." He nodded but didn't elaborate, and she respected that. Some griefs didn't belong to midnight roads and unfamiliar company. After several miles, Brandon spoke again. "You don't have to take me all the way. There's a small turnoff about a mile ahead. I can walk from there." Caroline's brows pulled together. "I'm not dropping you off in the dark with men following you, Admiral Caroline," she corrected quietly. Brandon blinked, then turned his head slightly toward her. "Caroline." He repeated the word, careful on his tongue, as though he wasn't used to saying anyone's first name anymore. "I don't want to put your safety at risk. They might." "Your son is in danger," she said, "which means you are. And if you're in danger, that makes this Navy business. That makes it my business." He didn't speak for a moment. Finally, he murmured, "Thank you." The sincerity in his voice was heavier than the words themselves. They reached the turnoff and followed a narrow road flanked by tall pines. The houses were spaced far apart, each one softened by porch lights, glowing like small lanterns amidst the darkness. "Third house on the left," Brandon said. Caroline slowed as they approached a modest one-story home with a white fence and a porch light shaped like a lantern. A child's drawing, faded from the weather, was taped inside the window. It felt like a home built on quiet love. Brandon's posture eased as he stepped out of the SUV. For a man who had spent years in shadows, the sight of his house brought a different light to his features. Something warm, vulnerable, almost protective, in a way she hadn't seen yet. He motioned for her to follow him up the walkway. When the front door opened, a small boy with sandy hair and curious eyes looked up. He couldn't have been older than 8. "Dad, you're late." Caroline froze. Something in Declan's voice tugged at her heart, gentleness shaped by resilience. "Sorry, buddy," Brandon said, kneeling to meet his son's gaze. "Had a situation at the base." Declan's eyes flicked to Caroline. "Is she part of the situation?" Caroline smiled softly. "You could say that." The boy studied her with thoughtful seriousness before giving a shy nod. "She looks nice," he said, very matter-of-fact. Brandon blinked, a quiet laugh slipping out. "She does, doesn't she?" Caroline felt her cheeks warm in a way she hadn't expected. Inside the house was simple but tidy, filled with markers, Lego sets, and the faint scent of vanilla candles. Family life lived here. Not wealth, not perfection, just life. As Brandon brewed tea, Declan sat at the table swinging his legs and studying Caroline with innocent curiosity. "My dad doesn't bring people home," he said suddenly. Brandon, overhearing, dropped a tea bag. "Declan." "It's okay," Caroline said gently. "I'm honored. I'm the exception." Declan smiled, a small, pure smile, and Brandon lifted his gaze to meet hers. Something unspoken passed between them. Something that wasn't duty, or danger, or fear. Something human. After Declan finished his homework and disappeared into his bedroom, Caroline finally spoke. "Brandon, if those men know about your son, this house isn't safe." Brandon's expression hardened. "I know. We need a plan." He nodded slowly. "And Caroline," he said quietly. "Yes, thank you for coming here." Most people would have walked away. Caroline held his gaze, feeling the weight of his trust. "I don't walk away from people worth protecting," she said. And for the first time since they met, the hardness in Brandon's eyes softened not into fear or pain, but into something fragile and quietly hopeful. Something that felt dangerously close to the beginning of a bond neither of them had expected, yet both could feel forming like a whispered truth waiting for its moment. Morning sunlight streamed through the small kitchen window, casting soft, golden shapes across the wooden floor. The coal house, though modest, felt warm in a way that seeped into the bones, like a place built not from wealth, but from steady love and the stubborn will to keep going. Caroline Ward hadn't expected to spend the night on Brandon's worn but comfortable couch, yet neither he nor she had wanted to risk her driving home, while strange men watched the shadows outside. Brandon had double-checked the locks 3 times, tested the porch lights, and left a baseball bat leaning innocently against the doorframe. It wasn't much, but it was something. And Caroline had seen enough in his eyes to know he had contingency plans even she couldn't identify. When she stepped into the kitchen, she found Brandon standing over the stove, flipping pancakes with the kind of ease that came only from routine. Declan sat at the table in pajamas, swinging his feet and humming a soft tune between bites of fruit. The scene was so normal, so achingly gentle, it made her chest tighten unexpectedly. Declan looked up first. "Morning, Admiral," Caroline smiled. "Good morning, Declan. And you can just call me Caroline." The boy's face brightened as if she had given him permission to hold something precious. "Caroline," he repeated, testing the name like a new word that felt good in his mouth. Brandon glanced over his shoulder. "Hope you slept." "Couch isn't the Ritz." It was comfortable, she said. "I don't think I've slept that deeply in months." He raised an eyebrow, a quiet acknowledgement of the tension she normally lived under. Caroline grabbed a mug from the cabinet, and as she poured coffee, she caught a glimpse of Brandon's smile, small. Barely there, but enough to warm the room. "You cook every morning?" she asked. "Most days," Brandon replied. "Pancakes on Saturdays, eggs on Sundays. Everything else is improvisation." Declan chimed in around a mouthful of berries. "He makes the best pancakes on this side of Virginia Beach," Brandon snorted. "Only because I put chocolate chips in yours. That's what makes them the best," Declan insisted. Caroline laughed softly, the sound feeling almost foreign, lighter than she remembered herself sounding in years. As they settled at the table together, something shifted. It was subtle, the way sun tilts through clouds, or how the ocean breathes between waves. But Caroline felt it unmistakably. She wasn't an admiral in this moment. She wasn't a leader or a strategist or a public figure. She was simply welcome, seen, human. Declan opened his workbook after breakfast, his pencil in hand. "Dad," he asked, "can Caroline help me with my reading assignment?" "She has a teacher voice." Brandon froze mid-sip of coffee. "She has a what?" "A teacher voice," Declan repeated with solemn authority, like she's about to explain something important. Caroline tried and failed to hide her smile. "Well, I suppose I can take that as a compliment." Brandon's gaze traveled across her face, with a softness she hadn't yet grown accustomed to. "I think he likes you." "I like him too," she said, turning her eyes to Declan. The boy grinned, leaning closer to her as she guided him through his reading passage. Caroline had given hundreds of briefings, dictated orders across oceans, and negotiated with commanders twice her age, but the simplicity of helping a child pronounce tricky words felt strangely grounding. When Declan leaned his head lightly against her arm in quiet trust, something inside her melted warm and unexpected. Brandon watched quietly from the counter, drying dishes that didn't need to be dried. His posture softened his shoulders, lowering as if some invisible weight eased. The room felt fuller, like 3 separate lives had briefly aligned into something resembling family. But peace, Caroline knew, was fragile, and danger didn't respect quiet kitchens or pancake mornings. It happened around noon. Caroline was stepping onto the porch to retrieve the mail when she saw it something small and shiny tucked under the newspaper. At first, she thought it was a dropped keychain, but the moment she bent to pick it up, her breath stalled. A thin black metal emblem. A serpent, coiled, eyes etched in red. Her pulse quickened, beating sharply in her ears. "Brandon," she called, her voice low. He stepped onto the porch within seconds, instinct leading him more than sound. When he saw the emblem in her hand, the calm in his face didn't break, but his jaw locked, and a storm shifted behind his eyes. "How close were they?" she asked quietly. "Close enough to walk up to the porch without being seen," he said. "Which means they scoped the house first." Declan peeked from behind the screen door. "Dad." "What's wrong?" Brandon straightened instantly, adopting the tone of a father keeping his child safe. "Nothing you need to worry about, buddy. Why don't you finish your math, okay?" Declan hesitated, looking up at Caroline as if searching for confirmation. She knelt to meet his gaze. "Everything's fine. We're just going to talk grown-up things for a minute." He nodded slowly and disappeared inside. When the door clicked shut, Caroline rose to her full height, holding the emblem between her fingers, as if it might burn her. "What does it mean?" she asked. "It means Brandon said." Voice low. "Darius wanted me to know he can reach me anywhere." Caroline felt heat rise in her chest, not fear, but anger. A righteous, protective anger she rarely allowed herself to feel. "You think he'll come back?" she asked. Brandon looked toward the tree line, where shadows danced quietly between the pines. "He already has," he said. "This is just his way of saying hello." Caroline's voice tightened. "You can't stay here." "I don't intend to," Brandon said. He turned toward the house, staring through the window, where Declan sat at the table, swinging his legs as he worked through multiplication problems. "All I've ever wanted is to give him a normal life," Brandon murmured. "A life without shadows." Caroline stepped closer, not touching him, but close enough that he could feel her presence, like a steady anchor. "And you will," she said softly. "But not by facing this alone." For a long moment he didn't move. The world around them was still too still. When he finally looked at her, something changed in his eyes. Not vulnerability, not dependence. Trust. Quiet, cautious, and profound. "We move tonight," he said. "And we do it together." Dawn crept into Brandon's neighborhood, like a hesitant visitor. Soft light slipping between pine branches. Mist pooling low along the quiet street, and the pale sky tinged with the muted blue of an early morning that was still deciding whether to be peaceful or ominous. Inside the coal house, the world felt suspended, as if holding its breath. Caroline had barely slept. Her instincts wouldn't let her. Brandon hadn't slept either, though he pretended otherwise. She had heard him checking windows long after midnight, moving with the patience of a man who had learned to make silence his weapon. Something in him shifted the moment that black serpent emblem appeared on the porch. Not panic, never panic, but a sharpening of focus so precise it felt like watching a blade being honed. At 5:12 a.m., Caroline sat at the small kitchen table, a mug of coffee cooling between her palms. The house was quiet, except for the soft sound of a child breathing behind a half-closed bedroom door, and the faint creak of an old water heater warming up. She almost allowed herself to believe the night had passed without incident. Almost. Then she saw Brandon freeze in the living room. He had been adjusting the blinds, letting in just enough light to gauge the view outside. But suddenly, he tilted his head, listening to something she couldn't yet hear. Caroline stood. "What is it?" Brandon didn't answer at first. He moved closer to the window, barely shifting the blinds. His eyes narrowed. "There," he murmured. Caroline stepped beside him, careful not to disturb the fragile line of sight he had created. And then she saw it. Not a person, Not yet. But a shadow moving between the trees at the edge of the yard. Slow, measured, intentional. Caroline's breath steadied. Could be a neighbor. Brandon shook his head. Neighbors don't move like that. Another figure appeared, barely visible but clearly coordinating with the first. A third stood behind a car parked down the street, pretending to scroll a phone. Though the angle was wrong, the stance too stiff. Caroline recognized the signs instantly. Behavioral, tactical, purposeful. "Black serpent," she whispered. Most likely, Brandon replied. Her pulse tightened, but not in fear. More like readiness. "Is Darius with them?" "No," Brandon said, eyes scanning motion lines she couldn't even see. This isn't his style. He doesn't get his hands dirty unless he has to. He sends scouts, observers, pressure. So they're here to send a message. He nodded. And to test the perimeter. Caroline swallowed. "What do you need me to do?" Brandon turned to her, then not as a janitor or a former operative, but as a man who needed someone he could trust. "I need you to stay calm," he said, "and I need you to help me guide Declan through this." Caroline nodded, the answer immediate and absolute. "I can do that." When he looked away, she caught a flicker in his expression, relief buried under layers of discipline. Then Brandon moved with the precision of a man who had mapped the house 1,000 times in his mind. He closed the blinds, fully checked the side door, and whispered toward Declan's room. "Buddy," he said gently, "time to wake up." Declan rubbed his eyes and shuffled out, still half asleep. But the moment he saw Brandon's serious expression, he straightened. Children learned fast when life asked it of them. "Is it those men again?" he asked quietly. Caroline knelt beside him. "Yes," she said softly. "But you're safe. We're here." The boy nodded, his courage small but unmistakably real. Brandon guided him toward the hallway closet, the one reinforced with an old storm door and lined with blankets and emergency supplies. Not a bunker, but safe enough for a temporary shield. "Stay here," Brandon murmured, brushing a hand through Declan's hair. "No matter what you hear." "Okay," Declan swallowed. "Okay, Dad." Caroline placed a reassuring hand on the boy's shoulder before closing the door gently. The moment the latch clicked, Brandon's entire demeanor shifted. His shoulders squared, his breathing slowed, his awareness sharpened as though every fiber in his body activated at once. Caroline felt the change like a shift in temperature. "They're closing in," Brandon said. "How many?" she asked. "4," he replied. "Possibly 5. She moved to the back window. "I see 2 flanking the fence." He gave her a quick glance, surprised but impressed. "You've done field work," she smirked faintly. "Just because my uniform is white doesn't mean I've only sat behind desks." He huffed a soft breath, a laugh without volume, but appreciation lit briefly in his eyes. Then the world outside went still. Birdsong stopped. Leaves no longer rustled. Even the morning breeze seemed to pause. Brandon whispered, "This is it." Caroline positioned herself near the hallway where she could move between windows' doors and Declan if needed. Her mind worked through strategies, angles, outcomes. Everything she had learned over years of command condensed into instinct. The first sign came quietly, a glint of metal, a shadow sliding across the porch, footsteps muted but deliberate. Then a soft tap, not threatening, just a test. Caroline felt her muscles tighten. "They're checking response time," Brandon murmured. "And what's ours?" she whispered. He glanced at her. "You're looking at it." Before she could respond, the porch boards creaked just enough to betray the weight of someone shifting. A silhouette passed in front of the window, paused, adjusted. Another shadow flanked the side yard, but nothing broke. No window shattered. No door rattled. It was more psychological than physical, a display A reminder. A warning. Then just as silently as they had come, the shadows retreated one by one, dissolving into the breaking dawn. Caroline exhaled the breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Brandon watched the tree line for another full minute before finally stepping back. "They didn't attack," she said. "They weren't here to attack," replied quietly. "They were here to tell me the clock is ticking." Caroline stood beside him, her voice low but resolute. "Then we don't wait for them to choose the next move." Brandon looked at her, surprise flickering again, this time followed by something deeper. Respect. Trust. Gratitude. "What do you suggest?" he asked. Caroline stepped closer, her eyes steady. "We take the fight out of the shadows, and we start by protecting the thing Darius wants most." Brandon swallowed. "Declan." "No," Caroline corrected softly. "Truth. The truth you've been carrying alone for far too long." For the first time that morning, Brandon let out a slow, shaking breath. Not from fear, but from the quiet realization that he wasn't alone anymore. The house was quiet after the dawn encounter, too quiet in the way silence settles after fear has brushed against the walls and retreated. Sunlight slipped through the blinds in thin, pale lines, dust floating in gentle spirals, as if the world was trying to pretend nothing had happened. Caroline Ward sat at the small kitchen table, her fingers curled around a mug of coffee gone cold. She wasn't thinking about the attack itself. She was thinking about Brandon's eyes afterward, steady on the outside, but carrying a sorrow so old it felt ancestral. A sorrow that wasn't fear, but exhaustion. Brandon Cole had been running from shadows long before Black Serpent showed up on his lawn. Across the room, Brandon checked the locks again, not compulsively, but with deliberate precision. When he was satisfied, he exhaled and leaned back against the counter, arms, folded gaze lowered. "Declan's doing okay," he murmured, nodding toward the hallway where the boy was playing quietly with his Legos. "He's trying not to show it, but he knows something's off." Caroline looked toward the bedroom door, emotion tightening in her chest. Declan had been brave, braver than most adults she'd trained. "We owe him the truth," she said softly. Brandon shook his head, voice low. "No, he deserves safety. Not truth. Not this kind of truth." Caroline studied him carefully. His shoulders were broad and strong, but the weight pressing on them was far heavier than flesh could bear. "Then tell me," she said. "All of it. No holding back." Brandon's eyes met hers, vulnerable, almost pleading, as though he'd been waiting for someone to ask, but terrified of being believed. He pulled out a chair and sat across from her. The distance between them felt small, intimate, like the closing of a long open wound. "The code isn't a weapon," he began quietly. "It's a record one that should have never existed." Caroline leaned in. "Your last mission?" Brandon nodded. "The retrieval was supposed to be simple," he said. "A communications drive from an informant who claimed he had information on an internal leak. We were told the drive contained classified data intel that needed to be extracted quickly." His fingers curled lightly around each other. "We didn't know the leak was inside our own unit." Caroline's breath tightened. "Darius." Brandon nodded again. "He manipulated the mission, altered the intel, set the route, chose the landing coordinates. And when we arrived, the informant was already dead. The drive was waiting for us like bait." Caroline felt a cold shiver run down her spine. "He set you up to take the fall," she whispered. "No," Brandon said. "He set up the whole unit. I was just the only one who realized it too late." He swallowed hard, his jaw tightening. "The moment our boots hit the ground, everything went wrong. Comms jammed, drones down, our exit blocked. The only reason we escaped at all was because Walsh, my second in command, stayed behind to break the perimeter." Caroline's heart sank. What happened to him? Brandon's voice cracked for the first time. He didn't make it. Silence pressed against the room like a heavy curtain. I dragged the rest of the team out. Barely. But when command demanded answers, I couldn't expose them. I couldn't let the Navy tear apart the lives of men who had only followed orders. "So you took responsibility," Caroline whispered. And when I did, Brandon continued. Darius framed the rest. He planted evidence in the wreckage. Altered logs. Signed forged orders. Everything pointed to us. Caroline's face hardened, and the code Brandon reached slowly into the pocket of his jacket. For a moment, Caroline thought he'd retrieve a device, but instead he placed a simple metal key on the table. A small, unimpressive object, but his hands treated it like a live wire. "This opens a storage locker," he said in an abandoned depot outside Norfolk. "Inside is the original data drive from that day, the one Darius left behind." Caroline stared at the key. "You kept it." "I didn't mean to," Brandon admitted. "After the mission, when they pulled me from the program, I went back for the bodies. For closure. I found the drive in Walsh's pack. He must have grabbed it before the end." Caroline closed her eyes briefly. Walsh had spent his final moments trying to expose the truth. "You didn't turn it in?" she asked quietly. Brandon shook his head. "I knew if I did, Darius would find a way to bury it. Or me. Or worse, my team. So I hid it. I figured as long as I stayed off the radar, the drive wouldn't mean anything to him. But a few months ago..." He paused. Caroline could see the uncertainty in his breath. "I saw one of his men outside Declan's school, just watching. Not approaching. Just watching." Her heart dropped. "That's when I knew," Brandon said. "Darius realized I still had the drive, and he'd keep coming until he got it." Caroline's voice softened. "Why didn't you go to the authorities?" "Because the unit doesn't exist," Brandon replied. "And because what Darius did, if it came to light, it would collapse a lot more than just one career. It would expose a leak inside a classified program, damage diplomatic ties, destroy trust in covert operations. And you thought no one would believe you." Brandon looked away. "They never have before." Caroline reached across the table, her voice steady and quiet. "I believe you." Brandon's gaze lifted, a flicker of shock and relief passing through his features. Caroline didn't let go of that moment. "You and Declan will not face this alone," she said. "And if Darius wants a war of shadows, then he just made a tactical mistake." "What mistake?" Brandon asked, wary. Caroline leaned closer. He underestimated the wrong admiral. A faint, unmistakable warmth entered Brandon's expression. Hope. Real, fragile hope. "And he underestimated the wrong father," she added softly. For a moment, the world outside seemed to disappear. The danger, the shadows, the past. Only truth remained, sitting between them like a fragile but unbreakable bond. Brandon closed his hand over the metal key. "When this is over," he whispered, "I want Declan to remember this as the moment everything changed, for the better. Not the worse." Caroline nodded. "Then let's make sure it is." Evening settled slowly over the coal house painting, every room in warm amber tones that blended with the soft glow of table lamps. For a moment, one fragile, precious moment, the world outside felt distant. No silent scouts hidden in the trees, no coded warnings left on the porch, no ghosts of the past breathing down Brandon's neck. Just quiet, just stillness, just three people sharing a home that suddenly didn't feel big enough for all the emotions pressing against its walls. Declan sat cross-legged on the living room rug, building a Lego ship with intense concentration. Brandon was pretending to help, but was mostly placing the wrong pieces in the wrong spots to make the boy laugh. It worked every time. Declan giggled until he lost track of the instructions. Caroline watched them from the kitchen doorway. Her chest tightened painfully. Brandon Cole, the man she met less than 48 hours ago, had layers inside him she hadn't expected. Not just the disciplined soldier or the haunted operative, but a gentle father who carried tenderness in the same hands that once held classified weapons. A man who cooked pancakes, checked locks twice, and crouched down to make sure his son felt taller than the world that had once broken him. That mix, strength and gentleness did something to her, something she hadn't let herself feel in a long time. When the Lego ship was finished, Declan stood proudly and held it up. Brandon clapped in exaggerated slow motion until Declan blushed from the attention. "Why don't you put it on your shelf before it sails away?" Brandon teased. Declan scrambled off down the hallway, leaving them alone in the warm, quiet living room. The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It wasn't fragile. It hummed low alive, tethered to something neither of them could quite name yet. Caroline approached slowly, hands lightly clasped. "You're good with him," she said softly. Brandon didn't look at her at first. His eyes lingered down the hallway where his son had vanished. "He deserves good," he murmured. Caroline's voice warmed. "He has it." When he finally looked at her, the room seemed to shrink like the air thickened in the space between them. "Caroline," he said quietly, "you didn't have to stay this long. Not many people would." "Not many people are worth staying for," she replied. His breath caught just barely, but she saw it. Outside, wind rustled the pine branches along the fence. Inside, the faint hum of the refrigerator became the only sound anchoring them to reality. Brandon exhaled slowly. "I should be the one protecting you, not dragging you into something unsafe." "You're not dragging me," she said. "You're letting me in." "There's a difference." His expression shifted, not soft, not hard, just honest. "I'm not used to that," he admitted. "I can see why." For a long moment, they simply stared at each other, two people with too much history behind their eyes, drawn toward something that felt incredibly dangerous and incredibly right at the same time. Caroline stepped closer. "Brandon, you don't have to hold everything alone. Not your past, not this situation, not the fear." Her voice gentled. "And not the hope, either." He blinked slowly. "Hope," he whispered. "Yes," she murmured. "Hope." The word seemed to strike something deep in him, something that hadn't been touched in years. His breath unsteady, Brandon reached for the back of a chair, not to steady himself physically, but to ground the rush of feeling that threatened to overtake him. "Caroline, I can't ask you to." "You're not asking," she said, interrupting gently. "I'm choosing." His eyes softened like a tide rolling back from the shore, revealing everything he had kept hidden, the grief, the fear, the longing, the buried warmth, one he didn't believe he deserved anymore. When Declan returned to show them his proudly placed Lego ship, the moment broke gently, but didn't disappear. It lingered in the room, like an unfinished sentence waiting for nightfall. Hours later, after Declan was tucked into bed, and the house had settled into the soft quiet of night, Caroline stood by the hallway wall, reading old photographs that hung in mismatched frames. Brandon joined her silently, his presence warm behind her. "You and your wife Caroline?" asked softly, nodding toward a picture of a smiling young woman holding a toddler version of Declan. Brandon's voice lowered. "Yeah, she looks kind." "She was," he said. Then after a beat, "Losing her was the day everything went dark." Caroline touched the frame gently before lowering her hand. "You kept the light on for Declan?" she murmured. "Even when you couldn't see it yourself." Brandon inhaled slow and uneven, and when he looked at her again, something inside him surrendered, quietly, gratefully. "Caroline," he whispered. "I don't know how to do this." Do what she asked, stepping closer. "This," he said, gesturing faintly toward the small space between them. "Let someone close again." She placed her hand lightly on his arm. "You start with one step." "What step?" he asked. "This one," she whispered. Brandon's breath hitched. He didn't lean forward like a man chasing desire. He leaned forward like a man returning home. Their lips met softly. Slow, tentative, the kind of kiss that wasn't rushed or claimed, but discovered. A kiss filled with the fragile courage of two souls who had spent too many years starved of tenderness. It was gentle, warm, almost unbearably human. When they parted, their foreheads rested together, breathing the same quiet air the world reduced to the fragile moment they had finally allowed themselves. And then, a creak. Soft. Wrong. Out of place. Caroline's eyes snapped open. Brandon stiffened. They turned toward the hallway. "Declan," Brandon called. Silence. He took 2 steps forward before Caroline's voice anchored him. "Brandon." The front door. He looked. It was slightly ajar, a single inch, but enough to break a father's heart. Brandon's pulse surged. He rushed to the door, swinging it wide, scanning the yard. Nothing. Just the quiet hum of streetlights, the faint rustle of trees, and on the welcome mat, a piece of paper. Folded once, his name written in sharp black ink. Caroline's stomach dropped. Brandon opened it with trembling hands. 4 words. "We have your son." The world collapsed in an instant, not loudly, not violently, but with the quiet devastation of a man losing the one thing he lived for. Caroline stepped beside him, her voice steady even as her chest tightened. "Brandon," she whispered, gripping his arm, "we will get him back." And for the first time since they met, Brandon, Cole, broke not in weakness, but in a father's silent, devastating cry. The world did not end with a scream. It ended with silence. A silence so sharp, so cold, so absolute, that it carved into Brandon Cole's chest the moment he read the 4 words scrawled on the folded paper. "We have your son." He didn't shout. He didn't crumble. He didn't rage. He simply stood there in the open doorway, breathing like a man trying to remember how lungs were supposed to work. Caroline stepped toward him, her voice steady even as her heart pounded. "Brandon." "Look at me." He couldn't. Not yet. His whole life, every choice, every sacrifice, every step into the shadows had been for one purpose: Declan, his little boy, his only remaining reason to breathe. And now taken. Brandon's hands trembled before curling into fists, knuckles whitening as he forced himself to grow still. Controlled. He inhaled through his nose, exhaled through clenched teeth, discipline clashing with terror. Caroline reached for his arm gently. "We will get him back," she said, "but you cannot lose yourself now." Her words found him not as orders, not as comfort, but as an anchor. He lowered the paper. His eyes, when they finally met hers, were raw, broken, but lit with a fire she had not yet seen. "A message like this means they want something," she said. "Darius isn't impulsive. He doesn't take unnecessary risks. He wouldn't hurt Declan unless Brandon's voice cracked through the quiet." "I know what he wants." Caroline nodded. "The drive." Brandon looked toward the hallway where Declan's Lego ship sat proudly on the shelf. "He knew I'd never give it up. Not for my safety. Not for my life. But for Declan." Caroline stepped closer. "He's wrong. Because we're not giving him anything, not on his terms." Brandon blinked as if her words were something foreign, something he'd forgotten existed. "We," he whispered. "Yes," Caroline said firmly. "We." For the first time since the note appeared at the door, Brandon's chest eased enough for him to breathe fully. "Then we need a plan," he murmured. They sat at the kitchen table where only hours earlier, Declan had practiced multiplication. Now the table was a war room, a map of the area, a sheet of paper, Caroline's laptop, and the metal key to the storage locker, small but infinitely powerful. Caroline leaned forward. Darius will want to control the battlefield. He'll choose a place where he can watch every angle. Brandon's jaw tightened. He'll also choose somewhere isolated. He knows I won't risk involving the Navy. Caroline typed, quickly pulling up aerial maps. There are dozens of abandoned warehouses within 10 miles. But if I were him... Her finger tapped a location near the coastline. Here. Brandon stiffened. You know it. Yes. It used to be a distribution center, shut down after a hurricane. Only one way and no security cameras, and the road is obscured by pines. Brandon closed his eyes. That's exactly where he'd take him. Caroline looked at him carefully. We can go together, but you have to stay sharp. Darius is expecting you to come unhinged. He's counting on it. Brandon nodded slowly. I won't give him the satisfaction. She held his gaze. Good. Because we're not going in there as victims. We're going in there as people who know the truth. Before they left, Brandon paused by Declan's room, his fingers resting on the doorframe. I'm coming, buddy, he whispered. It was a promise carved from the deepest part of him. The warehouse loomed against the evening sky, like a wounded giant rust, peeling down its metal walls, windows cracked, the old loading dock sagging under years of neglect. The air smelled faintly of salt water and old oil. Caroline killed the headlights before the car rolled to a stop. Brandon sat motionless, hands gripping the key to the storage locker so tightly it dug into his palm. Are you ready? Caroline whispered. Brandon opened the door. No. But I'm going. They entered through a side gap where the metal siding had buckled. Inside the warehouse was dim, filled with dust motes, drifting like ghosts between sunbeams. Their footsteps echoed quietly across the concrete floor. Then a voice rang out. Too calm, too confident. Brandon Cole, it called from the shadows, right on time. Brandon's shoulders stiffened. Caroline stepped slightly in front, assessing angles, listening to the faint reverberations of the voice bouncing off metal beams. Darius Venn stepped into the fading light. He was taller than she expected, lean, sharp-eyed, wearing civilian clothes that didn't match the severity in his posture. His hair was cropped short, and his smirk was a razor-thin slice of arrogance. But it wasn't Darius that made Brandon stop breathing. It was the small figure standing behind him, hands tied loosely, face smudged with tears that had dried on too quickly. Declan. Dad, the boy cried. Brandon instinctively stepped forward, but Darius lifted a hand casually. Let's keep this civilized. Caroline's teeth clenched. Darius's gaze slid to her. And you must be the Admiral. Nice of you to join this little reunion. Caroline ignored him. Her eyes were on Declan, assessing, evaluating, ready. Darius circled slowly like he was savoring the tension. You have something that belongs to me, he said. Brandon didn't look away. You mean evidence of your betrayal? Darius laughed softly. Call it what you want. Hand it over. Brandon held up the metal key. This is what you want. Darius's smile thinned. At last. But I'm not giving it to you, Brandon said. Darius's eyes flashed. Do you think you get to choose? I have your son. Brandon stepped closer, his voice low and steady. No. You have my attention. Not my surrender. Caroline's heart surged. That was Brandon, quiet strength, unbreakable even under the weight of fear. Darius scowled. You think truth matters. You think the Navy will expose itself over some outdated files. Caroline stepped forward, now her voice sharp as steel. It's not outdated when it proves a man died because of your actions. And it's not outdated when it exposes a leak. Darius's jaw twitched. He hadn't expected her to speak. "You're playing a dangerous game, Admiral." "I don't play games," she said. "I end them." For the first time, uncertainty flickered across Darius's face. Brandon looked at Declan again, his voice softening. "Buddy, close your eyes." Declan obeyed instantly. And then Brandon moved. Not violently, not recklessly, just decisively. He stepped between Darius and the boy, with a speed that was more instinct than skill, years of training condensed into one protective motion. Caroline closed the distance, seizing Darius's attention long enough for Brandon to shield Declan fully behind him. Darius froze, not because he feared them, but because he suddenly realized he had lost control of the narrative. Caroline spoke quietly but firmly. "It's over." And in that moment, with Declan clinging to his father's side and the truth standing on the brink of daylight, Brandon felt something he had forgotten, the beginning of freedom. The days after Darius Ven's arrest unfolded like a slow sunrise, light emerging where darkness had lived far too long. For the first time in years, Brandon Cole woke each morning without the weight of footsteps he could not see, or shadows he could not outrun. The invisible chains he had lived with were gone, dissolved in the moment. Truth finally reached daylight. Darius had been taken into custody by federal authorities, that same night escorted away in quiet but decisive professionalism. There were no headlines. Classified matters never made the morning news, but the impact rippled through the corridors of command. A formal investigation opened within hours, and Brandon's testimony, along with the recovered data, was handled with more care than he'd ever hoped for. It was over. Not with vengeance, but with justice. And justice, he realized, was a softer thing than he remembered, gentle, patient, not demanding blood, but truth. Caroline Ward stood beside him outside the courthouse, where his debriefings had just concluded. Her white uniform seemed to glow in the late afternoon sunlight, crisp and immaculate, just as her reputation had always been. But today she didn't look like the admiral who commanded fleets. She looked like the woman who stayed beside him when the world shook. The woman who helped him face a monster he once called brother. The woman who helped save his son. "Done?" she asked quietly. Brandon exhaled a long, cleansing breath. "Done," he said. "For the first time in a long time. Done." Caroline studied him. "What happens now? Officially?" Brandon's gaze dropped to the courthouse steps. "They're clearing my record, restoring my status. They even offered reinstatement." Caroline's brows lifted, proud but also searching. "And what did you say?" Brandon looked at her softly, like the answer had been in his heart long before the question was asked. "I told them I'm not the same man who left the Navy. I'm a father now. And my mission is home." Caroline's eyes warmed with something deep and sincere. "I think that's the bravest mission you've ever chosen." Brandon felt the truth in that. The battlefield taught courage of a certain kind, quick, sharp, survival-driven. But fatherhood demanded a softer courage, one born from love, not fear. "I want to give Declan something steady," he said. "Something peaceful. Something I couldn't give him before." Caroline stepped closer. "And what about you, Brandon? What do you want for yourself?" No one had asked him that in years. He wasn't sure he knew how to answer. But when he looked at her, really looked, he realized the answer had been following him like a quiet echo. Something real, he said. Something honest. Something that feels like home. The air between them warmed. Caroline's voice lowered. "You deserve that." He swallowed his chest, tightening not with fear, but with gratitude he didn't know how to express. "So do you," he said. For a long moment they stood in the fading light, not as admiral and former operative, not as two people bound by crisis, but as two souls who had found each other in the rubble of broken pasts. Weeks passed. Routine returned to the Cole home like a long-lost friend. Declan went back to school, his laughter echoing through the hallways as he raced to show his friends pictures of the Lego ship he'd rebuilt this time in brighter colors, because life is brighter now, he'd said. Brandon worked around the house fixing the porch steps, repainting the fence, replacing the old coffee maker that sputtered every morning. There was a peace to his movements, now a steadiness in his breath that Caroline noticed every time she visited. And she visited often, not out of obligation, not out of duty, but because something about the Cole house felt like a space she hadn't had in years, a space where she could lay down her uniform and simply be. One evening, months after the warehouse standoff, Caroline arrived carrying a bag of groceries. "Hope you like salmon," she called as she stepped into the kitchen. Brandon looked up from the stove, smiling in a way that always softened her heart. "As long as you don't burn it," she smirked. "I outrank you. Watch your tone." He laughed, and the sound filled the kitchen like sunlight. Declan burst into the room a moment later. "Carolyn, look. I got an A on my reading test." She knelt, beaming. "I knew you would. You worked hard. I'm proud of you." Brandon watched them with quiet awe. Two people he cared about more deeply than he had ever allowed himself to imagine. When dinner was ready, they ate together, the house full of warmth conversation and the gentle comfort of shared life. Afterward, Caroline helped Declan with his homework, while Brandon washed dishes, humming a soft tune under his breath. It felt right. All of it. Deeply, profoundly right. Later, after Declan fell asleep, Brandon walked Caroline to her car. The night was cool, the stars piercingly bright above the treetops. "Thank you for today," he said. "For dinner," she teased. "For being here," he replied softly. She turned to face him fully. "And where else do you think I'd be?" Brandon hesitated, not from uncertainty, but from the weight of what he was about to say. "Caroline," he murmured the day this started, "I told you to pretend to be my wife." She smiled gently. "I remember. I don't want either of us to pretend anymore." The night air seemed to still. Brandon stepped closer, not bold, not rushed, simply sure. "I want a life with you," he said. "Something real. Something steady. Something that feels like all the pieces of my past finally found where they were meant to land." Caroline's breath shivered, but only because her heart had been waiting for this moment longer than she would ever admit. She touched his cheek gently. "I don't want to pretend either." Their kiss was soft, patient and warm, like two souls learning to breathe in the same rhythm after years of holding their breath. And when they parted, the world felt different. Not because danger had ended, not because shadows had lifted, but because healing had begun. Together. Months later, a small house near the Virginia coast stood quietly against the morning light. Brandon's tools sat neatly on the porch. Declan's bike leaned against the railing, and Caroline's white uniform hung on a hook inside no longer worn daily, now replaced by her new position training young officers, and spending more time with the two people who mattered most. One morning, as sunlight streamed across the living room, Brandon wrapped his arm around Caroline's waist. "Remember that day?" he asked softly. "The one that changed everything, Frotont." She smiled, leaning her head against his shoulder. "Yes," she whispered. "When you told me to pretend to be your wife." "And now?" he asked, brushing a thumb along her cheek. She turned her voice warm and certain. "Now," she said, "I don't need to pretend at all." And in that small house by the sea, where love had grown from courage and healing, had risen from the ashes of old wounds, they built a new beginning, a beginning born not from fear, but from the quiet, undisputed truth that hearts once broken can find their way home again. Before we close today's story, we'd love to hear from you. Where in the world are you watching from your comments? Help us feel a little closer to each other, no matter the distance. And if our stories bring you comfort, hope, or even just a quiet moment of peace, we invite you to subscribe to our channel. It allows us to keep creating heartfelt, uplifting stories for you every single week. Thank you so much for spending your time with us today. Your presence, your support, and your kindness truly mean more than we can ever say. Until the next story, take good care of yourself.